I'm going to talk about a little bit different perspective, which is the adoption of research animals from a large academic institution and some of the special considerations that we've taken over the years. So first, our adoption program is actually quite old. We adopted out our first animal in 1983, so almost 4 decades ago, and the first animal we adopted out was a hound. And since then, the program back then was a bit more informal and rudimentary, as you can probably imagine. And we've made a lot of changes and progressed our program quite a bit over the years, which I will talk about. But this slide is just to give you a concept of the different types of species, a number of each species that we've adopted out over the years. So you can see that dogs are the most common and most popular species that we've adopted out at around 250. These are rounded estimates, followed by cats, but we'll basically adopt out any species that we determine is eligible and that has someone that wants to adopt them. Rabbits is also quite common. We've adopted out many New Zealand whites and Dutch belted rabbits. We've also adopted out a lot of sheep, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on in this talk. And then a lot of our other rodent species as well can be pretty popular pets. So we've adopted out guinea pigs, hamsters, rats, and chinchillas. And then thus far, we've adopted out one pig to a farm. And this is an image of that pig with its new friend. So again, we'll adopt out pretty much anything and everything that we can. This was touched on already, so I won't talk about it too much, but there are a few big no-nos to be aware of if you're starting an adoption program. Of course, that you can't adopt out any species that's illegal to own as a pet. Make sure you know your state laws. Non-human primates is obviously one of the biggest examples here. And then, of course, genetically modified animals. I'm going to spend a little bit of time focusing on the next 2 points, which are, can we adopt out animals that have had major surgical procedures, and should we adopt them out? And can we adopt out animals with, quote, permanent medical conditions? And again, should we adopt them out, and what are some of the considerations? I think these 2 points, which I'm going to go over in more detail, kind of set our program apart from other institutions' programs. And I think it's good food for thought and kind of broadening everyone's approach to adoption and the types of animals that they adopt out. So the first examples I'm going to go over are animals that have had major surgical procedures as part of their study protocol and considerations for adopting them out. So this sort of began around 4 years ago, and how most stories begin is someone at your institution falls in love with an animal, and it wasn't slated for adoption based on the study protocol, but they really wanted to see if it was any chance that we could adopt out the animal at the end. And so the first animal that we kind of did this with is Dory, pictured here. I don't know if you can actually see my pointer. You can't, but on the left here is a dog named Dory, and she was part of a study where she did have a lot of surgical manipulations as part of the study protocol, and that included both gastric and duodenal cannulas, and then also spinal implants with leads that led to those cannulas. And this is all, again, covered in the ACUC protocol. At the end of the study, one of our trainees at the time had fallen in love with this dog and wanted to adopt her out. So we discussed the possibility of doing surgical removal of all of these implants and decided to go forth with it. It ended up being a lot of surgery time. We did two, about 8-hour-long surgeries, but we were able to get all of these implants removed and send her home. And so this is kind of one of the best sort of starting stories, I think, about kind of broadening again your thoughts about what types of animals can actually be eligible for adoption, and not just thinking about, well, only animals that are, quote, healthy or have not had any major manipulations on study protocols can be adopted out, because that's not really necessarily the case. We can adopt out a lot more than that. And so she's gone on and has been living a happy, healthy life. And so that's really great. We also have another study on the right. The right picture here is actually 2 animals that were adopted by another one of our trainees at our institution. The dog Charlie was our first animal that we adopted out from this particular study protocol. On this study, it's a urethral stricture model. And again, the animals have a number of surgical procedures as part of the study protocol. And in the beginning, when this protocol had started, we did actually, it was standard per the protocol to euthanize the animals at the end of the study in order to obtain the tissues needed for histological evaluation and for study completion. But we had some discussions again because we discussed, is there any way that we can get these dogs adopted out at the end of the study? And the end result of that discussion was we could, it would just require another surgical procedure in order to allow the PI to be able to get the tissues they needed, but also then again, allow the animal to be adopted at the end. So these animals, as part of their study protocol, have what's called a scrotal urethrostomy. It's actually a standard surgery that's done in small animal practice if animals have chronic urethral stones or strictures. So the vets will help the PIs with this procedure. And then at the end of the study, we do a penectomy, so a surgical removal of the penis. These are all male dogs. Again, for the study, this is how the urethral stricture is created. And so surgical removal of the penis is required, again, to allow the PI to get their study tissues and then allow us to adopt these animals out. And so again, at this point, I think we've adopted out upwards of 30, 35 of the dogs on this protocol, and they all do perfectly well. They're very happy and healthy, and other than some kind of awkward questions at the dog park, they don't have any ongoing issues after adoption. And then the other example that I want to talk about is our cats. So we have a cat study that's an ocular model. And as part of this model, they use one of the eyes as a study eye and that undergoes study manipulations. And then one of the eyes is the control eye. So it doesn't undergo any study manipulations. And so rather than, euthanize these animals at the end of the study to take out their study eye, again, for the PI, the veterinary staff will perform an enucleation of that study eye, give it to the PI so that they can get the tissues that they need, and then we'll spay or neuter the animal under the same anesthetic event and then put them up for adoption. Again, we've adopted out dozens and dozens of these cats, and lots of our staff have them, and they also do very well. Another example, more recently, we've had a lot of PIs that have started to do sheep work here, and we have some sheep models where they do surgery, in utero surgery, and use the lambs for study, and the ewes are allowed to give birth naturally here. And so once they give birth naturally and the lambs are used for study, we have been adopting out the ewes. And so part of the study involves, again, in utero surgery. So these animals will have 2 laparotomies during their time here, the ewes, and then again, they heal, give birth, and then we've adopted out those ewes. So again, these examples are really just, I think, important to kind of open your eyes and give you a different perspective on just because an animal, again, has had a major surgical procedure as part of their study protocol, it doesn't prohibit them from being able to be adopted out at the end and live a good, happy life. The other consideration is animals with, quote, permanent or chronic health conditions. And so, again, originally, we sort of would kind of prohibit these animals from being adopted out because we want to make sure that, again, we're adopting out, quote, healthy animals. But there's many conditions that certainly in any, normal context wouldn't make an animal unadoptable or unable to be a good, happy, healthy pet. And so we have adopted out animals that have chronic health conditions. And in the next slide, I'll talk about just an additional piece of paperwork that we do sort of from the legal perspective to cover this. But one example is this chinchilla tater tot. So we adopted out this chinchilla while this chinchilla was in our animal facility. It had some symptoms of essentially chronic herpes virus infection. It would have occasional flare-ups. Just like pets do at home, we would treat those flare-ups here, and then it would recover. And this chinchilla was slated to be adopted out to one of our lab members. This is her daughter here holding the chinchilla at home. And, we talked about this health condition and kind of what it would entail as far as long-term management at home, and they understood and were in agreement and still wanted to adopt out this chinchilla. And so we agreed to do so. And again, I'm going to show in the next slide just some paperwork that we use to cover these types of things. The cat in this slide is her name's Gloria, and she suffered. She was on the study that we do the enucleation and adopt them out. She suffered a brachial plexus injury after her study was over while she was waiting to be adopted out. She already had owners that had chosen her. And so at that time, we had actually decided to keep her in-house, treat her for this injury for a few months, and until she was able to be cast free and had recovered sufficiently. But she still required long-term medication at home while she was continuing to recover from this injury. Because it is something that can take at least a year or more to recover from. And we talked at length with the adopters about this, and they were in agreement that they wanted to take her home and they were willing to do these medications with her. And then this is her, the second picture of her here is probably about a year after she went home, and she's completely off medication, fully healed, and again, happy and healthy. This is hard to read, but it's not intended that you read it. It's just an example of, I show some other of our legal paperwork that we do for all of our adoptions a little bit later on. But whenever we adopt out an animal that has, one of these health conditions that we've discussed with the owner, we do write up a separate form, this letter here, that kind of describes the condition, what it entails, and what type of long-term care that the animal might need that's outside of the norm, in order to ensure that, we've had this conversation with the adopter, they understand and agree to be able to take on that responsibility and provide that care. We faced a few challenges, of course, like everyone that has an adoption program or starting adoption program. I did just want to talk quickly about the Maryland Beagle Freedom Bill, which was passed in 2018 here. You might be familiar with this. It's a bill that legislation that's been pushed by an animal rights group via the Beagle Freedom Project. And this group, their goal is to ultimately pass legislation in every state that requires that research institutions search for homes and placement of dogs and cats that are used in research at the end of study for any animals that are eligible for adoption. And when this bill was being taken into account for Maryland in 2018, a couple of our veterinarians had actually speak at the Senate on our behalf. And the only thing that was sort of a consideration for us with this bill was that the bill was going to require that we utilize third-party agencies in order to adopt our animals out. And I know this was talked about a little bit in the last talk, but for our institution in particular, we really didn't want that to be a requirement, but more of an option, because our program had been established for so long and we've been so successful adopting animals out directly from our institution that we didn't want that to be a requirement for every adoption, because we thought it would actually make it more challenging for us to adopt animals out. We were able to get the bill passed where the use of a third-party agency was just an option and not a requirement. So essentially, if we are unable to find a home for eligible animals, then we do have to use a third-party agency, which we do have a relationship with. But again, it's not a requirement. And we've actually not had to use that, a third-party agency to date. As far as the use of third-party agencies, it is important, and this was emphasized in the last talk, to make sure you have a well-established relationship with someone who you trust and they understand all of the regulations and all of your institution's requirements for adopting these animals out. If you don't, then you're kind of setting your institution up for some liability. This is we had an instance several years ago where we did used to use third-party agencies. We had sent a cat home with a foster into a foster home environment, and I had gotten a call from that foster home that said that the animal was having some clinical issues, and I said, "Where's the animal now?" And I found out that the animal was sitting in a PetSmart waiting to be adopted. And so that was kind of a turning point for us, where it was sort of like, we want to make sure we know where our animals are going when they're going for adoption. And so it really is something to take into account and make sure that you are establishing relationships with third-party agencies that are following all of the steps that you want them to take. The other thing that we've kind of encountered is how do we advertise safely? These are retired research animals. And we have to be careful about our advertisement of these animals. And along those lines, I mentioned here a saturated market. So at our institution, we have operated mainly on word of mouth. And in general, that's worked really well. We almost never have any issues finding animals' homes. Sometimes it might take a little bit longer than expected, but eventually we get all of our animals adopted out. So we've recently discussed how can we advertise safely to make sure we're kind of expanding our reach, because we've sort of adopted everyone in our department and has adopted out every animal that they want to adopt out at this point. And so something as simple as the sign here, are you interested in adopting a retired research beagle? Just email for more information. We've posted those in lots of all of the lots of different buildings on campus, in the mouse facilities, different labs, and it's a fairly innocuous sign, but we've actually gathered a lot of new interest for animals just with a simple signage like that, posting in different buildings around campus, and so that's been very successful thus far. The adoption program from start to finish, the steps are pretty simple, but there's a few important points I want to make here. That first conversation with the potential adopter is very, very important. It's the time to really gather all the information that you want to gather from them about their interest in adoption, their understanding of adopting a research animal, what that means, and kind of what their life is like, their intentions, and of course for them to ask you any questions that they might have. We've streamlined this process quite a bit over the last year or so. This is a picture of one of our behaviorists, Missy Painter. She's really been crucial in streamlining this process and making sure that we're following all the same steps with every person that approaches us. And we apply these steps to anyone, even if it's someone that works directly in our department. It could be, Missy had to follow the steps herself. She adopted 2 cats from us. So we don't make exceptions for anyone, even if we know them or they work for our department. Everyone has to follow the same steps. This first conversation is usually either over the phone or in person, and it's always includes Missy as representing our behavior team, and then myself to offer the veterinary perspective on these animals with the potential adopter. I do want to highlight the importance of having a behaviorist and behavior team backing your adoption program and helping your adoption program. It's especially for dogs, for instance, things like leash training, doing behavior evaluations, talking to potential adopters about acclimation and training at home and how they're going to get along with other animals that they might have is really crucial to, again, just making sure you're making the right match. The other thing I wanted to talk about with the first conversation is just in how important it is that you really never know if someone has the right intentions. And again, you're opening up your animal facility to people. You're having them come in and meet animals for adoption. You want to make sure they're there for the right reasons and they truly want to adopt an animal. We actually had, a couple of years ago, there was a lab member that I worked very closely with on their study protocol, and she had mentioned to me that one of their administrative personnel in their office had wanted to adopt a cat. So I said, sure, send her down, let's talk, she can meet the cats. And, as we started talking about 5 minutes in, I kind of realized that she was actually there to information gather. She was kind of prying and seeing, like, do we really take care of our cats? Do they get fed on the weekends? Just these types of questions that really made me realize that she was kind of there for the wrong reason. She was just trying to get information and thinking that we don't take care of our animals, and kind of wanted to see the inside scoop and not really interested in adopting an animal. So you do have to be very, very careful, because you are opening up your institution and there is liability. And so these conversations, you can actually learn a lot. And then really quickly, once we have that conversation and they say, yep, I want to come meet your animals, we have them come in, meet and greet, make sure they're choosing an animal that, again, their personality fits what they're looking for. And then decision time, we don't really press for decisions until we have another person that's interested in the same animal. So if someone said, I really like this dog, but I need, a couple of weeks to kind of think about it, figure out if it's the right decision for me, it's a big decision. We don't really press them on that. And again, if someone else comes in and they express interest in the same animal, then we'll reach out to the first person and say, we have some other interest. It would be, we really need you to make a decision. There's a formal application process, which I will show you a screenshot of. And then once that everything goes through, we just schedule the adoption and go from there. Really quickly, prior to adoption, this is kind of covered a little bit already, but we do a final physical, of course, make sure they're healthy. As far as vaccinations, one of the things I emphasize in my meetings with the doctors is that the animals in our facility are not necessarily vaccinated for everything that, you know, the regular veterinarian would recommend they be vaccinated for when they go out into the real world, because they live in a research facility. They're not necessarily exposed to the same thing. So they might not be on heartworm, flea, tick preventative. We're not going to vaccinate for Lyme disease. They're not exposed to the outdoors, those types of things. So we make sure that the owner understands their responsibility for establishing a relationship with a regular veterinarian outside after they adopt the animal, and that veterinarian is going to have some additional recommendations for that animal. All of our animals are microchipped. We talk to them about registering their microchips. We spay and neuter them, and then we'll do any other, you know, clinical workup that we think is warranted. I did want to just mention the certificate of veterinary inspection. We have done some interstate adoptions, so it is important to have someone on your team that's accredited and can do these certificates so that you can do interstate adoptions. This year, we discovered that you might have to do things you never thought you would have to do if you want to adopt out different species of animals. So again, we adopted out a lot of ewes, but we also had a lamb this year that was born in-house and ended up not being needed for study. And so we adopted that lamb out, but legally the lamb needs a scrapie tag. And so we actually called our state department and we registered Johns Hopkins as a sheep flock. And we had flock ID tags sent to us. We looked into purchasing the special applicator that's needed, put it on the sheep, and then he was ready to go. I'll go over this pretty quickly, but documentation is of course important, and all of the documentation that we do for our adoptions were approved by our legal department. So if you're starting an adoption program new, that's something to talk about with your legal department. Some of the forms that we do a PI release form. This form is signed by the PI to agree and state that they are releasing the animal from their study protocol in order to be adopted out. And then we have the adoption application. We have a signed adoption agreement that again covers the responsibilities of the owner, the new owner of the animal, that they agree that they're going to provide appropriate veterinary care from then on, and other types of things. We also provide the owner with a medical history. I'm going to show you guys some screenshots of these, and then vaccination records, of course. So this is a cutoff version, but our adoption application is essentially a shortened version of what you would fill out for a shelter. And it kind of gathers the important basic information that we need to know. And then one of the things which is you don't see here, but we do ask for a reference and call the reference, just like you would if you were a shelter looking for a adopter and making sure that that they check out. And then the adoption agreement again captures the responsibilities of the adopter and that they're taking on full responsibility for this animal. And then this is our medical summary form. We kind of alter this to meet the needs of the specific animal that we're adopting out, but the basics are usually the same. And this summary form is sort of our version of here's a copy of your animal's clinical record, so they can take this to their vet when they set up an appointment so that they have all the pertinent information there that they need. They have the date of birth, the date that they were spayed or neutered, they have their full vaccine history and anything else that's pertinent on hand, microchip number, etc. This is a really useful sheet. We do provide other medical information or records as needed or requested. So if we did do blood work on an animal, we'll redact any sensitive information from that, and we can send that to the owners as well. So after all of this is said and done, the animals go home, and this is these are a bunch of pictures of some of the animals we've adopted out over the years. Again, lots of cats and dogs, but also rabbits and guinea pigs and other cute species. And so we always ask for pictures to get sent to us because we love seeing the animals in their new homes and enjoying their new lives. And it's always great to get emails from our adopters, especially if it's a year down the road and I'll get a surprise email. Remember you adopted this cat to me and here's him living his best life. So they're really great to have, and it's the best part of the job. So. And then acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge Missy Painter, who's again our behaviorist, who started last year, and she's really helped streamline our program and keep it running smoothly. And I really couldn't do it without her. Dr. Eric Hutchinson, our current AV, these pictures are to serve two purposes. The main one's to embarrass him, but the other one is to bring up an important point, which is that you need the support of your institution, you need the support of your AV to have a successful adoption program. We use a lot of resources and time, and it does take effort, but it's definitely worth it, and you do need to have the support though. Dr. Bob Adams is our former AV. He retired last year, but he was the person who started our adoption program in the 1980s, and so we wouldn't have it without him. And Dr. Lydia Hoppers, also our behaviorist, and she's again been just very crucial in working on getting more formal behavior evaluations and working with these animals to get them in a more adoptable state before they leave. All the residents for all the help that they do getting these animals adopted out. They help with surgeries, they help with paperwork, they help find adopters. They beg us to adopt animals. And so thank you to all of them for all their hard work. And then all the PIs, of course, for being very open to adopting out their animals, and even being open to when we kind of say, hey, if we just did this one surgery on your animal, we could adopt them all out at the end. And so it's really great to have them be on board with our program as well.